This is Owen Gaines, aka Q-Tip, with episode 3 of Poker's Postflop course, part 1, The River. Now, in episode 1, we covered do we have a profitable value bet and how to choose the best size. Episode 2, we talked about a profitable bluff and how to choose the best size. Here in episode 3, we're going to wrap up points 3, 4, and 5, talk about how to compare a value bet and a bluff, talk about inducing bets, and how to choose which is most profitable. So we learned that bluffing is not an alternative to consider after you determine you do not have a profitable value bet. You can have a profitable value bet, but still have a more profitable bluff, and vice versa. A few points to make before we walk into the session. Number one, in all of these situations we analyze, the opponent will call some bet size with more worse hands than better hands. In other words, a profitable value bet is actually an option. Number two, the opponent will fold some better hands to some bet size. Otherwise, a profitable bluff isn't an option. So we have some hand that's not the nuts and it's not the nut low. The opponent has some better hands, he has some worse hands, and then we find ourselves in a situation where we need to compare a value bet and a bluff to determine which is better. Point number 3, the bet size of number 1 and number 2 are different. So we can't pick one bet size in a pot. Say the pot's $100. We can't bet $50 and go, well, sometimes this is a value bet and sometimes this is a bluff. No, we have some given assumptions about how the opponent responds to a $50 bet, and that's either a value bet or it's a bluff. It can't be both. And typically the bluff size is larger than the value bet size because our opponent tends to fold more hands the larger our bet gets. Again, always exceptions to that, but that is the typical way opponents respond. And finally, we're going to use true EV to compare value betting and bluffing. There is no more evaluative EV as we did when comparing value bet to checking and bluffing to checking. Or comparing value bet and bluffing to one another, we're going to look at the true EV of each decision to determine which is better. I've often heard opponents say, well, my hand is too strong to turn into a bluff. I don't know what people mean when they say that, but I know what meaning is accurate. We can know that our hand is too strong to turn into a bluff when we have a value bet with an EV larger than the pot. The reason we know this is true is that we learned in episode 2 that the EV of a value bet cannot be larger than the pot. We make a certain bet size, the opponent folds his entire range. What we can win is capped by the size of the pot. So if we have a value bet, the opponent calls some bet size with a given X worse in his calling range that produces an EV larger than the pot, we know that we no longer have to consider a bluff. So I've created this table. It looks a little intimidating at first, but this is actually quite simple both to understand and to memorize. That shows us a given bet size that will produce an EV the size of a pot when our opponent calls with a given X worse. So in other words, if we could bet pot and our opponent would call with 2X worse in his calling range, in other words, we have 66.6% equity in his call versus his calling range, that value bet will produce an EV the size of the pot, and we no longer have to consider a bluff. And we can go on down and talk about a 3X worse calling range to a half pot bet produces an EV the size of the pot. We no longer have to consider a bluff, and so forth down this list. To memorize this chart, it's quite simple. You can look at the number in the denominator, and the X worst calling range is one number larger than that. So here's a 3, the X worst is 4, quarter pot bet, the denominator is 4, the X worst is 5. So that's an easy way to memorize that. So with any of these combinations of a bet size and an X worst and a calling range, these value bets produce an EV the size of the pot, which eliminates the need to think about a bluff. So this thinking can be done quickly at the table, and it turns into a simple situation where we can determine which line is better, a profitable value bet or a profitable bluff. Now, if this simple situation isn't available, the decision between a value bet and a bluff is more subtle. We say this simple situation, if we don't have a value bet that produces an EV the size of the pot, but we do have a profitable value bet and we do have a profitable bluff, then we have a little bit more to think about. And to begin to start thinking about how to analyze those situations, I begin with this graphic. And this is a fun one. This graphic represents 100 combinations in his range. We can go from 10, 20 on, all the way up here. And these points are folding points in the opponent's range. So say at V2, the opponent folds 20% of his range. He folds 20 combinations, and then he calls all the combinations to the right, 80 combinations. And as we increase our bet size, we get more fold equity, i.e. the opponent folds more and more of his range. And we look at a folding point like V1. We call this a folding point, but this is the opponent calls with his entire range. This is a 4x worst calling range. So he's calling with his entire range, and if we can get him to call with all his hands, with his 4x worst calling range for a third pot bet, then we have a value bet. That's what the V stands for, value bet, with an EV the size of the pot, and we no longer have to think about bluffing. We could look at, say, V3. This is a 2x worst calling range, and if we could get the opponent to call a pot size bet at this folding point, then again we have a value bet with an EV the size of the pot, and we don't have to think about profitable bluff. And we can swing on up into folding points in the yellow where the opponent folds all his worst hands, so obviously no value bet is an option. But here he folds 1/3 of his better hands, and if we can get him to reach B1 for a half pot bet or less, then we have a profitable bluff. And of course B4, he folds his entire range, and then we would have an EV the size of the pot. And I look at a couple of these graphics, and I introduce a concept called no bet land. I think it's kind of fun. From N1 to N2, of course, if the opponent reaches a folding point of N1 and he calls with these worse hands and these better hands, then we would have a neutral bet, whatever bet size that is. He's calling with the same amount of worse hands and better hands, and it's a neutral EV. But anything still inside the blue here that's in between N1 and N2, we don't want any money going in the pot at all. He's calling with more better hands than worse hands, so we don't have a profitable value bet. And if we thought we were going for a bluff, obviously that's not working because he's not folding any of his better hands. So this is no bet land. And then everything to the left of N1 is where we gain value in our value bets, and I call this value land. And in the book, I talk about the relationship between our overall equity against the opponent's entire range, how that impacts the size of no bet land and impacts our ability to get value from our opponent in value land. And this concept allows us to create some pretty cool charts. And this particular one is betting against a flat range. And what's happening here is that for every $10 increase in our bet size is on the bottom, EV on the left here. For every $10 increase in our bet size, the opponent is folding an extra 10% of his range. So at a $20 bet size, he folds 20%, $30, 30%, etc. We only go to 90% here. So this is in a $100 pot, and I quit at $90. So if we went to a $100 bet, he fold his entire range, it would get capped here at $100. And so we look at having an overall equity of 60%, 70%, 80%, and 90% in different range shapes. As I said, this is all a flat range. And we look at how bet sizes perform against these assumptions. And this particular one creates something of a V shape. And the bottom point of the V, everything to the left is value bets. Everything to the right is bluffs. And we can see at a 60% overall equity that frequently bluffs perform better than the value bets. And we move to 70%, we see what happens there. 80% value bets tend to be better than bluffs. And then here at the 90% equity, value bets dominate the scene. We never get to the point where the V starts to happen. So I create charts in the book for weak ranges, strong ranges, polarized ranges, and bell ranges. And we see how bets tend to perform with different overall equities. And then I summarize how we should typically respond in those various situations. So we can just kind of think about our overall equity, what range shape our opponent has, and we have a good idea of what's going to be better, a value bet or a bluff, without really going through all the math. After that, I introduce a section I call opening the betting, and this is answering the question, what do I lose by betting? And the fact is, when it's checked to us in position, we have the luxury of deciding whether or not any more money goes in the pot. When we do decide to make a bet, we give our opponent that option, and he has the option to now raise. And villain's ability to check raise with a mixed range, in other words, some strong hands, some weak hands, it can nullify an otherwise profitable value bet because he's going to be able to steal from us with some bluffs. So I spend 4 or 5 pages in the book talking about the type of things that impact the severity of opening the betting. A couple things are the remaining effective stack and villain's X worse in his calling range. And you'll see this chart in the book, talk about how those combinations work together to when we can bet unreservedly and when we need to be more cautious with our betting. I'm not going to go over that in detail here, except to say that the size of the villain's inactive range plays a role in the size of the villain's bets play a role in how much he can punish us for opening the betting. But a main point I make in the book is that the fear of the opponent raising hinders many players from making good value bets. But normally the fear is unjustified. The opponent has to be aggressive. If he wishes to bluff, sometimes he'll be done leading out. We must have less than 80% equity versus the opponent's calling range before he can punish us so much that we shouldn't bet, we should check back. And the villain must bluff skillfully. If he bluffs too much, it could be good for us. If he bluffs too little, then he's not doing it enough to steal enough from us. So all these things have to be in place before you really start to think about, maybe I should check back instead of bluffing because the fear of opening the betting is too dangerous. But talking about opening the betting introduces another idea, and that's this inducing bet. An inducing bet is typically a small bet. It's intended to display weakness to an aggressive opponent to provoke him into raising with a worse hand. It's almost like you open up the door to allow him to value bet himself. In the book, I talk about how to compare an inducing bet size with a value bet size, as well as bluffing, although I spend most of the time talking about comparing an inducing bet size with a value bet size. And again, I won't go into much detail here in the video, other than to say the sizing difference between an inducing bet, because it is a smaller bet, and then how large you can make your value bets. That difference in the bet size plays a pretty heavy role, as well as how frequently the opponent will raise, as well as the sizing he'll use with his raising. But this is a move you don't want to really go for too often, because again, there are some things that have to line up to take advantage of this. And firstly, the opponent has to decide to bluff with a check raise instead of a bet. He has to read hands well, and then he has to actually do something about his hand reading by attacking weakness, by putting his money where his hand reading skills are. So this will take you through to the end of the checker bet in position section. At the end of it, there will be 11 test your comprehension questions and answers, 5 exercises with various questions inside of those, as well as a review of the checker bet section, the entire section in a nutshell. So that'll do it for that, and then in episode 4 we'll begin out of position play. Look forward to seeing you there. Any questions, hit me up in the forums. Thanks for watching.